I paid for every ticket, every meal, every ocean view room, and they still left me standing alone at the airport like I didn't exist. I remember the exact moment it happened, the soft hum of rolling suitcases, the distant echo of boarding announcements, and the way my phone felt unusually heavy in my hand as I checked the departure screen for the third time. Flight 247 to Maui. On time. Boarding. I smiled to myself, thinking they were probably already at the gate, saving me a seat, maybe even laughing about how I always arrive early. That's who I've always been, the one who plans, who pays, who makes sure everything is perfect. At 68, I thought I had earned the right to be included, at least in something I had built from the ground up. This trip wasn't just a vacation. It was supposed to be a thank you to my family, a way to bring us back together after years of quiet distance I pretended not to notice. I had spent weeks choosing the resort, comparing reviews, making sure the rooms had enough space, enough comfort, enough beauty to make everyone happy. I told myself it would be different this time. That Daniel would put his phone down. That Ashley would smile at me without that tight politeness that never quite reached her eyes. I told myself this trip would remind us what family used to feel like. I reached the check-in counter and gave my name, still holding on to that fragile hope, but the young man behind the computer paused for just a second too long. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then he glanced up at me with a look I couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said gently, "I don't see your name on this reservation." I let out a small laugh, the kind you make when something is obviously a mistake. "That's not possible," I replied. "I paid for all of it." He nodded, typing again, checking more carefully this time. "I do see a booking under Collins," he said, "but it's for 3 passengers." 3. The word landed quietly, but it echoed louder than anything else in that busy airport. 3 tickets. Not 4. I stood there for a moment, not speaking, not reacting, just listening to the silence that suddenly felt louder than the crowd around me. I pulled out my phone and opened the message Ashley had sent 2 days earlier. "Everything's taken care of," she had written. I remembered reading that line and feeling relieved, even grateful, like maybe she was finally including me in something instead of managing me from a distance. My fingers scrolled down, searching for something I might have missed, some detail I misunderstood. There was nothing. Just that one sentence. "Everything's taken care of." I looked back at the screen in front of the agent, at the names listed there, Daniel Collins, Ashley Collins, and their son, Ethan. A perfect little family. Complete. I felt something shift inside me then, not a sharp pain, not even anger, but something colder, something quieter. Understanding. Because in that moment, standing under those bright airport lights, I realized this hadn't been a mistake. It wasn't a scheduling error or a forgotten detail. It was a decision. A deliberate, quiet decision to leave me behind using the very money I had given them. I thanked the agent, my voice steady, almost calm, and stepped away from the counter. Around me, families hurried past, laughing, arguing, living their lives without noticing the woman who had just disappeared from her own. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text Ashley. I didn't ask why. I simply turned toward the exit, the automatic doors sliding open as if they had been expecting me all along. And as I walked out into the cool morning air, one thought settled in my mind with absolute clarity. I finally understood my place in their world. And more importantly, I understood exactly what I needed to do next. I drove home slowly that morning, keeping both hands on the wheel as if letting go for even a second might cause everything to fall apart, the city passing by in a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt distant and unreal, and when I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, neat, quiet, dependable, as if nothing had shifted at all, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, that subtle change in the air, like something invisible had been rearranged. While I was gone, and I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, the same counter where I had spent years preparing meals for my family, birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners that stretched for hours, all of it coming back to me not as warmth, but as a series of quiet realizations I had ignored for far too long. I opened the refrigerator without thinking, staring at the neatly arranged containers of food I had prepared for the trip. Meals I thought we would share together in that beautiful oceanfront villa, and I closed the door gently, realizing they would never be touched, not there, not with me. I walked into the dining room and ran my fingers along the polished surface of the table, remembering how many times I had sat at the head of it, watching Daniel laugh, watching Ethan grow, watching Ashley smile in that careful, measured way that always seemed just slightly out of reach, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see those moments clearly, not as memories of connection, but as patterns. Small things I had dismissed, like the way Ashley would take over conversations when money was involved, or how Daniel would avoid my eyes whenever decisions were made without me, and I realized this did not begin at the airport. It had been building quietly for years, hidden in polite smiles and convenient excuses. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed, my suitcase untouched in the corner, packed for a trip that was never meant for me, and I let the silence settle around me, not heavy, not suffocating, but clarifying, like a fog lifting to reveal something that had always been there. I thought about the last Christmas, how Ashley insisted on handling the arrangements, how I was told to simply enjoy myself while she managed everything, and how I ended up paying for most of it anyway, the decorations, the catering, the gifts, all of it presented as her effort, her organization, her generosity. And I remembered the birthday before that, when Daniel thanked her publicly for planning a dinner I had quietly funded, and how I smiled, telling myself it did not matter, that family was not about recognition, that giving was enough. But now, sitting there in that quiet room, I understood something I had refused to admit. Giving had never been the problem, it was the expectation that I would always give, without question, without acknowledgement, without limits. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard Daniel used to play in as a child, the same yard where I had once believed I was building something lasting, something unbreakable, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had become less of a person in their lives and more of a resource, something dependable, something useful, something easily overlooked. And strangely, that realization did not break me, it steadied me, because for the first time, I was no longer confused, I was no longer asking why, I was simply seeing what was, and that clarity brought with it a quiet sense of control. I turned away from the window and picked up my phone, not to call them, not to confront or accuse, but to scroll through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed in years, the attorney who had handled my husband's estate, and I stared at it for a moment before pressing call, listening to the steady ring on the other end, feeling something shift fully into place inside me, not anger, not revenge, but decision, because if they had already decided who I was in their lives, then it was time for me to decide something too. I had not spoken to that attorney in nearly a decade, not since the day we finalized my husband's estate, and yet when his voice came through the phone, steady and familiar, it felt as though no time had passed at all. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said, and I could almost picture him sitting behind that large oak desk, files neatly stacked, everything in its proper place, a man who understood order, structure, and the quiet power of decisions made on paper. "I would like to schedule a meeting," I told him, my voice calm, measured, without hesitation. As soon as possible. There was a brief pause, just long enough for him to recognize something in my tone, something different from the woman he had worked with years ago. "Of course," he replied, "tomorrow morning at 10. I agreed without needing to check my calendar, because for the first time in a long while, nothing else felt more important. The next morning, I dressed simply, a light gray sweater, dark slacks, nothing that called attention, nothing that suggested anything unusual, and when I walked into his office, the scent of polished wood and paper greeted me like an old memory, grounding me in a way I had not expected. He stood to shake my hand, his expression warm but observant, the kind of man who noticed what was not being said, and as we sat down, he did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply waited, giving me the space to speak when I was ready. "I need to make some changes," I said, placing my hands neatly in my lap. "To my will." He nodded slowly, pulling a file from his drawer, the same file, I realized, that had once represented everything my husband and I had built together. "Are you looking to update specific allocations, or is this a complete revision?" he asked, his tone neutral, professional, and I met his eyes without wavering. "A complete revision," I replied, and... For a moment, the room felt very still, not tense, not heavy, just precise, like the turning point of something that could not be undone. He began asking questions then, careful, structured, guiding me through each detail, assets, properties, accounts, each item laid out clearly, methodically, and as we moved through the list, I felt a quiet sense of clarity settle deeper within me. This was not about anger, not about punishing anyone, it was about alignment, about ensuring that what I had built, what I had protected, reflected the truth I now understood. And your son? He asked gently, pen poised above the paper, and I paused for the briefest moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to acknowledge the weight of the choice. Remove him, I said, my voice steady, without sharpness, without hesitation. The pen moved across the page with a soft, deliberate sound, and something inside me shifted, not a loss, but a release. We continued, redistributing, redirecting. Shaping something new, something intentional. I named charities I had quietly supported for years, organizations that provided meals, education, places where generosity was not taken for granted but received with dignity. And with each decision, I felt lighter, not because I was giving things away, but because I was finally choosing where they belonged. When we finished, he placed the document in front of me, the final version, clean, precise, binding, and I read it carefully, line by line, understanding every word, every implication. Before signing my name at the bottom, the ink flowed smoothly, without hesitation. And as I set the pen down, he looked at me with a quiet respect. Are you certain? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a confirmation, and I allowed myself a small, composed smile. I have never been more certain, I said, and as I stood to leave, stepping back out into the late morning light, I realized that nothing outwardly had changed. The world continued exactly as it always had, but something fundamental had shifted within me, something that could not be reversed, because for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me, I was deciding what would happen next. 3 days passed before I heard from them, and when the call finally came, it was not concern that I noticed first, it was timing. Daniel's name lit up on my phone just as I was finishing my morning coffee, the sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor in long, quiet lines, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not to play a game, but because for the first time, I was not rushing to meet them where they stood. Mom. Hey, his voice came through light, casual, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if I had not stood alone in that airport while they boarded a flight I had paid for. We just landed last night. Maui is incredible, you would love it here. I listened without interrupting, without filling the silence the way I used to, and in that small pause, I heard something I had missed for years, the absence of me in his words. Not once did he ask where I was. Not once did he acknowledge that I had not been there. It was as if my absence required no explanation, as if it was expected. That sounds nice, I replied, my tone even, polite, and I could almost feel him relax on the other end, reassured by the familiarity of my voice. By the lack of resistance. Ashley found this amazing place right on the water, he continued. We are already talking about coming back next year. Of course they were, I thought, because for them, this was not an exception, it was a pattern, one I had unknowingly supported for years. I am glad you are enjoying it, I said, and I meant it in a way that surprised even me, because the truth was, I was no longer waiting for their inclusion to validate my place. There was a brief hesitation then. A shift in his tone, subtle but noticeable. Did everything go okay with your flight? He asked, the question arriving late, almost as an afterthought, and I looked out the window, watching a bird settle on the fence, completely at ease in its own space. I did not go, I said simply, and the silence that followed was different this time, heavier, uncertain. What do you mean? He asked, confusion threading through his voice, and I let that question sit between us for a moment before answering. Not to create tension, but to allow the truth to stand on its own. I mean, my name was not on the reservation, I said, calm, direct, without accusation. There was a pause then, longer this time, and I could almost hear the pieces shifting in his mind, searching for an explanation that would make this feel like a misunderstanding instead of what it was. That does not make sense, he said quickly, too quickly. Ashley handled all of that. Of course she did, I thought, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to defend him, to soften the edges of what he was saying. I am sure she did, I replied, my voice steady, and something in my tone must have reached him, because he did not continue, he did not argue, he did not offer an immediate excuse. Instead, there was a quiet discomfort that settled into the space between us, unfamiliar, unsteady. Well, we will figure it out when we get back, he said finally, as if resolution could be postponed, as if this was something small, manageable, something that could be smoothed over with a conversation and a smile. There is nothing to figure out, I said gently, not dismissive, not harsh, just certain, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the line held open by something neither of us fully understood yet. Okay, he said eventually, the word carrying more weight than he likely intended, and when the call ended, I set my phone down on the counter and returned to my coffee, now slightly cooled, but still exactly where I had left it, and I took a slow sip, noticing how quiet the house felt, not empty, not lonely, but settled, as if it had been waiting for me to finally stop chasing what was never truly mine to begin with. And in that quiet, I understood something with complete clarity. They still believed this was a situation they could explain away, something temporary, something that would pass, but I knew better now, because while they were planning their next trip, their next conversation, their next version of events, I had already done something they had not even begun to imagine. The rest of that week unfolded with a strange kind of calm, the kind that comes when something inside you has already settled even if the world around you has not caught up yet. I kept my routine exactly the same, waking up at 6, making my coffee the way I always had, 2 scoops of grounds, just enough cream, no sugar, and I moved through the house with a quiet precision that felt different now, not automatic, but intentional, as if each small action belonged fully to me again. And yet, beneath that calm, I began to notice things I had overlooked before, not new events, but old patterns, memories that surfaced with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. I remembered the time Ashley suggested we consolidate our holiday plans to make things easier, how she framed it as a way to reduce stress for everyone, and how I ended up covering the entire cost while she received the thanks. I remembered Daniel asking if I could help with a down payment on their house, how he promised it was temporary, how Ashley assured me it was just until they got on their feet, and how that temporary arrangement quietly became permanent without ever being discussed again. I remembered birthdays where I wrote checks that were larger each year, not because anyone asked directly, but because I had learned to anticipate what would make things smooth, what would keep the peace, what would make me feel included. And as each memory settled into place, I saw the pattern clearly, not as isolated moments, but as a system I had participated in, one where my role had been defined not by who I was, but by what I provided. And for the first time, I did not feel regret for giving, I felt clarity about how it had been received. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Ashley, a photo of the ocean at sunset, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink, the water stretching endlessly beneath it. Wish you were here, the message read, and I looked at the image for a long moment, not because it moved me, but because it revealed something so simple it was almost startling. The distance between what was said and what was real. I set the phone down without responding, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been decided. Instead, I walked into my study and opened the drawer where I kept my financial records, everything organized, everything accounted for, years of careful planning, of quiet management, and I began to review them, not searching for mistakes, but understanding the full scope of what I had built, the accounts, the properties, the investments, all of it representing decades of work, of discipline, of choices made with the future in mind. And as I moved through those documents, I felt something shift even further, not just clarity, but ownership, a recognition that this was mine to direct, mine to decide, mine to protect. I made a few notes, simple, precise, confirming details that would matter later, ensuring everything aligned with the decisions I had already set in motion. And when I finished, I closed the folder carefully and returned it to its place. Nothing outwardly had changed, the house was still quiet, the day was still ordinary, but inside that quiet, there was a sense of structure, of control, of something steady and unshakable. And that evening, as the sun lowered and the light softened across the rooms, I sat in my living room and allowed myself a moment of stillness, not reflecting on what I had lost, but recognizing what I had gained, because while they were enjoying a vacation built on my generosity, I had already begun building something far more important, something they had never considered, and as I looked around the space that had once felt like a place I shared, I understood with complete certainty that it now belonged entirely to me in a way it never had before. They stayed gone for another 4 days, and during that time, something unusual happened, not around me, but within me. The need to reach out, to check in, to make sure everything was all right slowly disappeared, replaced by something quieter, something steadier, and when their messages came, they felt different, not because the words had changed, but because I no longer received them the same way. Ashley sent photos every morning, the beach, the pool, their breakfasts arranged neatly on white plates, captions that sounded warm on the surface but hollow underneath. Family time is the best time, she wrote in one, and I studied that sentence for a moment before setting my phone down, because for the first time, I saw it clearly. I had never truly been included in the version of family she presented. I had only supported it, funded it, made it possible. Daniel called again on the 6th day, his voice carrying a slight edge this time, not quite irritation, not quite concern, but something in between. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, and I recognized the question for what it was, not an expression of care, but a response to my silence, to the absence of reassurance he had come to expect from me. "I am fine," I said simply, and I did not add anything more. I did not ask about their plans. I did not fill the space with the familiar warmth that used to come so easily, and again, there was that pause. Longer this time, more noticeable. "You have been quiet," he said, and I could almost hear the uncertainty beneath his words, the subtle shift in balance he could not quite name. "I have been busy," I replied, which was true in a way he could not yet understand, because while they were measuring their days in excursions and dinners, I had been measuring mine in decisions, in structure, in the quiet rearranging of things that mattered far more than any temporary trip. He hesitated, then tried again. "Ashley was worried you might be upset about the flight," he said, and I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, because even now, the situation was being framed as something emotional, something temporary, something that could be resolved with a conversation and an apology. "There is nothing to be upset about," I said, my tone calm, even, and final, and for the first time, he did not have a response ready. The silence stretched just a second longer than comfortable before he cleared his throat and shifted the conversation to something else, something safe, something neutral, and I let him, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left to confront, nothing left to clarify. Everything that needed to be understood had already revealed itself. After we ended the call, I walked through the house again, not as someone waiting for it to be filled, but as someone who fully occupied it. I noticed the details I had overlooked before, the way the afternoon light settled into the corners of the living room, the quiet rhythm of the clock on the wall, the sense of space that no longer felt empty, but complete. And later that evening, I opened my laptop and reviewed the confirmations from my attorney, the updated documents, the finalized structure. Everything exactly as it should be, secure, deliberate, unchangeable without my consent. And as I closed the screen, I realized something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They still believed this was a situation they could return from unchanged, that when they walked back into my home, everything would resume as it always had, the same roles, the same expectations, the same quiet transactions that had defined our relationship for years. But what they did not know, what they could not yet see, was that while they were away, nothing had stayed the same, not in the way that truly mattered. Because I had already stepped out of the role they had assigned me, and I had no intention of stepping back into it again. They returned on a Sunday afternoon, their car pulling into the driveway just after 3, the sound of tires against gravel carrying through the quiet house as I stood in the kitchen rinsing a cup, and I did not rush to the door. I did not wipe my hands quickly or adjust my appearance the way I used to. Instead I finished what I was doing, placed the cup carefully on the drying rack, and only then walked toward the front of the house, the door opening just as Daniel stepped inside, his expression bright, relaxed, still carrying the ease of someone who had spent days in comfort without interruption. "Mom," he said with a smile, stepping forward as if everything between us remained unchanged, and behind him, Ashley followed, her movements polished, composed, her eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on me with that same measured warmth I had come to recognize. "We are back," she added, her tone light, almost rehearsed, and I nodded once, acknowledging their presence without stepping into the familiar pattern of welcome they seemed to expect. "I can see that," I replied, my voice calm, even, and for a moment, something shifted in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as if they had walked into a room that looked the same but felt different in a way they could not yet explain. Ethan ran past them then, dropping his bag near the stairs, his laughter filling the space with a kind of innocence that had nothing to do with the quiet tension unfolding beneath it, and I watched him for a moment before turning back to Daniel, who now seemed slightly less certain, his smile fading just enough to reveal the question forming underneath. We brought you something, Ashley said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small box, neatly wrapped, a souvenir chosen with care or perhaps obligation. It was difficult to tell. I accepted it with a small nod, setting it on the table without opening it, not dismissive, not ungrateful, simply unchanged, and again, that pause appeared. Longer this time, stretching between us in a way that did not allow easy escape. So, Daniel began, clearing his throat slightly, we should probably talk about what happened. There it was, the conversation they had rehearsed on the flight home, the explanation, the version of events that would restore balance, or at least attempt to, and I met his eyes steadily, not challenging, not inviting, just present. There is nothing to talk about, I said gently, and Ashley's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something sharper beneath the surface. Margaret, it was a misunderstanding, she said, her voice smooth, controlled. There must have been an error with the booking. I handled everything myself. Of course she did, I thought, and I allowed her words to settle in the room without interrupting them, without correcting them, because the truth did not require my defense. I am sure you did, I replied, the same words I had used before, and this time, Daniel's gaze held mine a little longer, searching, as if trying to locate the version of me that would respond differently, the one who would accept the explanation, smooth over the edges, restore the familiar rhythm. But that version was no longer there, and he could feel it, even if he could not yet name it. We can fix this, he said finally, his voice softer now, less certain, and I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in clarity. There is nothing to fix, I repeated, and for the first time since they had walked through that door, neither of them spoke, the silence settling around us not as conflict, but as recognition, because somewhere beneath their assumptions, beneath their expectations, they were beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed, not in the house, not in the situation, but in me, and that change was not something they could adjust, explain, or reverse. The house settled into a new rhythm after that conversation, not loud, not tense, but unmistakably different, like a song played in the same key but at a slower, more deliberate pace. Daniel tried at first to restore what had always worked before, small gestures, casual conversations, invitations to dinner as if nothing had shifted, but each attempt seemed to lose its footing the moment it reached me, not because I resisted, but because I no longer stepped forward to meet it, and Ashley noticed it more quickly than he did. I could see it in the way her eyes lingered on me. Just a second longer than necessary, in the way her tone adjusted, softer at times, sharper at others, as if she were testing different approaches to see which one might still reach me. One evening, she suggested we sit down together, just the three of us, her voice carrying that familiar calm authority she had always used when guiding conversations in her direction. I think it would be good for us to clear the air, she said, placing her hands neatly on the table, her posture composed, controlled, and I took my seat across from her without hesitation, not because I believed the conversation would change anything, but because I understood that this moment mattered to them in a way it no longer did to me. Daniel sat beside her, quieter than usual, his attention moving between us as if trying to measure something he could not quite define. We never meant for you to feel left out, Ashley began, her words smooth, carefully chosen. There must have been some kind of miscommunication, and if you had just said something earlier, we could have fixed it. I listened without interrupting, letting each word settle fully before allowing it to pass, because the explanation was not new, only the delivery had changed. I see, I said when she finished, my voice steady, neutral, and the simplicity of the response seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have. She leaned forward slightly, her expression tightening just enough to reveal the effort behind her composure. Margaret, we are family, she continued, these things should not come between us, and for a moment, I considered the word she had chosen, family, how easily it had been used, how consistently it had been defined in ways that excluded me while still relying on me. You are right, I said quietly, and Daniel's head lifted slightly, as if he expected something more to follow. Something that would return us to familiar ground, but I did not add anything else, I did not offer reassurance, I did not soften the edges of what remained unsaid, and again, that silence appeared, not empty, but full of something they were only beginning to recognize. Ashley's gaze sharpened then, not openly confrontational, but searching, calculating. You have been different, she said, the observation slipping out before she could reshape it into something more neutral, and I met her eyes without hesitation. Yes, I replied simply, and in that single word, there was no apology, no explanation, just truth. Daniel shifted in his seat, his discomfort more visible now. Mom, we just want things to go back to normal, he said. And I understood then what they were really asking for, not resolution, not understanding, but restoration, a return to the version of me that made everything easier for them, that smoothed over inconsistencies, that carried the weight without question. And I shook my head gently, not in refusal, but in clarity. This is normal, I said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that neither of them could immediately respond to, because what they were facing was not a conflict to be resolved, but a reality to be accepted, one where the roles had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And as I sat there, calm, steady, entirely present, I realized that they were beginning to understand something they had never considered before, that the version of me they depended on was no longer available, and that whatever came next would have to exist without it. It was not until the following week that everything came into full view, not through a confrontation or a dramatic reveal, but through something far simpler, a letter, delivered quietly in the late afternoon, placed neatly in the mailbox at the end of the driveway. I retrieved it the same way I always did, without urgency, without expectation, but the moment I saw the return address, I understood what it represented. The law firm, the same one Daniel had known for years, the same one that had handled everything after his father passed, and I held the envelope for a moment before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that this was the point where what had been decided would begin to take form in their world. Inside, the language was clear, precise, formal in a way that left no room for interpretation, a confirmation of updated documents, a notice of record, and a statement that any previous arrangements were no longer valid. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table, exactly where it could be seen, not hidden, not emphasized, simply present. Later that evening, Daniel walked into the kitchen, his movements slower than usual, his attention caught almost immediately by the envelope. He picked it up without asking, reading quickly at first, then again more carefully, his expression shifting in stages, confusion, disbelief, and finally something quieter. Something heavier. Mom, he said, his voice no longer steady, what is this? I looked at him across the room, calm, composed, not distant, but no longer reaching toward him in the way I once had. It is exactly what it says, I replied, and Ashley appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the change in his tone, her eyes moving from his face to the paper in his hands, and as she read, the composure she had maintained for days began to thin, not breaking, but tightening, as if she were trying to hold something in place that was already shifting. Margaret, this cannot be right, she said, her voice controlled but sharper now. There must be some kind of mistake. I did not respond immediately, not to create tension, but because the moment did not require urgency. The truth was already there, written clearly in ink. There is no mistake, I said finally, and the words settled into the room with a weight that did not need to be raised or reinforced. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the kitchen, then stopping as if unsure where to stand. You remove me? He asked, the question quieter now, stripped of the certainty he had carried before, and I met his gaze steadily. Yes, I said, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, just a statement of fact. Ashley stepped forward then, her posture shifting, less composed, more direct. You are overreacting, she said, and I could hear the effort behind her tone, the attempt to reframe what was happening into something temporary, something reversible. This is because of the trip. We can fix that, we can make it right. And I shook my head slightly, not in rejection, but in clarity. This is not about the trip, I said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because somewhere beneath their assumptions, they were beginning to understand that this was not a response to a single event, but to something far deeper, something that had been building long before they noticed it. Then what is it about? Daniel asked, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. and I allowed a brief silence before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted the truth to be heard fully. It is about understanding, I said, about seeing clearly what has been there for a long time, and as the words settled, I saw it in their faces, not full comprehension, not yet, but the beginning of it. The realization that the foundation they had relied on was no longer there, that the